In this lesson, we're going to complete our examination of the model of the labor market by deriving the labor supply curve and then considering equilibrium in that market when we bring in the labor demand curve as well. So let's then first focus on the labor supply curve. Remember, when we think about the market for labor, we're imagining that the labor supply is determined by the worker, how much you're going to work or not work, and to stay home, do something else. Unlike the labor demand curve, which comes from the firm's decision. So in this lesson, we're going to focus on labor supply. Going back to the basic mantra of economics, we're going to derive labor supply considering the central idea that people make purposeful choices, in this case, whether to work or do something else, we're going to call something else leisure, and they do that with limited resources. In this case, they only have 24 hours in a day to work and sleep and take their leisure. So again, amazingly, the same principle is going to be applied to get a labor supply curve, same one we got the demand for chicken or the supply of refrigerators, the same concept's going to be applied here. People make purposeful choices with limited resources. The choices here are work versus leisure. Limited resources is amount of time. To make this work, we want to think about what the price of leisure is. Don't normally think about the price of leisure in general, but for an economist thinking about labor supply, the price of leisure is simply the opportunity cost of not working. If you have more leisure, then you have less work. And so what you're giving up is the opportunity to get a wage or a payment for your work. And so the price of leisure we're going to think of as the wage. And when we do this, remember, we're trying to make it simple to derive this curve. And so the idea is there's just two things you can do. You can work or you can not work. And that not work part is leisure. In reality, of course, you can do all sorts of different types of leisure. We'll discuss you can go to school, you can stay home, you can take care of the kids, go to the beach, whatever it happens to be. We're going to just lump that into one category just to make it simple. So often in economics, you have a pairwise choice. You have apples or you have oranges. In this case, you have work or you have leisure. And we're going to get this price of leisure here in terms of what the actual wage is. And it's an opportunity cost concept, as clearly must be reflected in this notion that the price of leisure is what you have to pay if you don't work. Now, what we're going to argue clearly is that when the wage rises, since we've defined the wage as the price of leisure also rises. And we're going to argue in that circumstance, since the price of leisure rises, you'll stop doing so much leisure. You reduce your decision to take leisure, reduce the number of hours of leisure, and in a sense, therefore, the person will work more. And that is the connection, if you like, between the labor supply, work more, and the wage. You can just imagine that sentence is, as the wage rises, the person will work more. That's kind of an upward sloping line between the wage and the amount supplied. So that's the basic idea, and it comes from this purposeful choice with limited information concept. When you think about leisure, as I mentioned, remember it's a very broad concept, and sometimes it's not leisure at all. If you're in school or studying or trying to do some things that don't involve work, frequently it's not just leisure going to the beach, it's something substantial. So going to school, for example, economists think of that as you're adding to your human capital, you're adding to your skills, your knowledge, your ability to, in the future, actually earn a higher wage. It's actually increasing your marginal product. So some leisure is quite productive in terms of the workforce and will affect the wage down the road. Not maybe that instance while you're in school, but later. So the way economists think of that is you're investing in human capital, and that human capital increases the marginal product of the worker in the labor market at a later point. So that's human capital. It comes from not working frequently, although you can sometimes accumulate human capital on the job by getting experience. But when you're thinking about school or training, you're accumulating human capital as you're taking leisure as defined in this particular lesson. So having said that, let's now think about the important income effect and substitution effect as it applies to labor supply. Remember, we talked about labor substitution income effects in the case of a good, if you're buying, say, toys versus necklaces or something like that. In the case of demand for a good, toys versus necklaces, the substitution effect and the income effect go in the same direction. And how does that work exactly? Well, suppose the price of toys rises, and as a result of that, necklaces are relatively cheaper. So you're going to switch from toys to necklaces as the price of toys goes up. So the quantity demanded of toys goes down. That's the substitution effect. But there's also this income effect that the higher price of toys means you have less real money to spend on both things. And so that income effect is going to add to the reduction in the quantity demanded of toys and accentuate the effect that comes from substitution. The two effects go in the same direction. And so that's how income and substitution effect works for a good. In the case of labor supply, they can go in the opposite direction. And that leads to an interesting situation where the labor supply can actually slope downward rather than upward, because they go in opposite directions. And so let's think about this a little bit. First of all, why would they go in opposite directions? Well, think about this. Suppose the wage goes up. Wage goes up is going to make you move out of leisure and take more work. But that higher wage is going to make leisure more attractive itself. It's like the income effect. You can now buy more leisure. Maybe with that greater amount of money, you take the opportunity to go to a resort rather than just go to the beach. So you'll take more leisure. So in this case, the substitution effect of a higher wage means you go out of leisure into work, but the income effect means you go more leisure or out of work. And so it offsets, in terms of the labor supply, the substitution effect. You can represent this in this curve, sometimes called the backward bending labor supply curve. It's used here just to illustrate the different possibilities that can occur because of this income effect going in the other direction. So in this picture we have labor supply we're thinking about for an individual. How much labor to supply, how many hours of work to work, how many weeks to work, whatever it happens to be. And we have the wage on the vertical axis. So at the bottom right part of this picture, you have a upward sloping labor supply curve as you normally would draw it, as we've drawn it in the past and in the examples which we've considered. And that upward supply represents the fact where the income effect is smaller than the substitution effect. It may be that you get an increase in the wage and that's going to dominate. You're going to try to work more hours or take a job you might not other work, might not other take, and that other alternative leisure where you may want to do more of it because there's more income, it's small compared to the substitution effect. So that's kind of the normal kind of supply curve that we consider, the upward sloping supply curve in this case for labor. But at some point, the wage is getting higher and higher, and the income effect therefore is getting higher and higher. And the income effect can even equal the substitution effect. It becomes about the same, and then the curve at that point tends to get nearly vertical. Your higher wage will tend to make you want to work more, but the higher wage will also make you want to work less and take more leisure. And so it kind of equalizes. But then at even higher wages, which is at the top part of the picture here, it could actually go the other way, and that's where the income effect is quite large. And it will be in the situation where, yeah, I'd like to work now more because of the substitution effect. I get more for working relative to leisure. But now, boy, I'm getting quite a bit more, so now I'll really like to take that leisure, do more, and it actually can have almost an anomaly that the higher wage means the worker will supply less labor. And that's the backward bending part. Economists focus mainly on situations where the labor supply curve is upward sloping, maybe quite steep as in the picture because of the income effect. But in principle, it's possible to get the upper part of this curve, which is the backward bending labor supply curve. For the market as a whole, assume we're in the normal region of a supply curve, we simply get the supply of labor by adding, again, horizontally, labor supply for each individual in the market, and then you have labor supply in the market as a whole. And so as a result of that, we now have derived not only the labor supply curve for the market, but the labor demand curve for the market, and we can think about the labor market model as a whole. Okay, so first of all, let's remember that the market as a whole is in this picture, which we've shown before, how quantity of labor is the total market. Labor supply we've derived based on the idea of individuals making purposeful choices and maximizing their utility, and labor demand curve from the firms. And the prediction is the equilibrium is the intersection of those two curves. Now the implications of this equilibrium, or this model of the labor market model, are pretty interesting. And we're going to explore that for a while. But the most interesting thing at this point is it tells us the wage is determined by the intersection of that labor demand, which you got from the firms, and labor supply, which you got from the individuals. And what that says is that the wages are closely related to how productive the workers are. After all, the labor demand curve is the marginal revenue product of labor, and we've argued that with profit maximization by the firms, that's going to equal the wage. As we mentioned, since you have in competition, marginal revenue product is the price times the marginal product, then effectively you could think of the wage divided by the price as equal to the marginal product. Sometimes economists call the wage divided by the price the real wage, because it's kind of correcting for prices or perhaps for inflation. And we're now predicting that this real wage should equal the marginal product. So I'd like to just think whether the theory is correct in any broad sense of the word. How well does it work? That's really what we're concerned about. It's the model and the real world are two different things. If the model doesn't explain or fit the real world, it's not a very good model. So we want to see whether this model is any good by taking really a first look and to test the model. So we want to look at these two things, some measure of productivity and some measure of wages. So the idea is to test the model over time by looking at that. To do this, I just want to look at something called labor productivity growth, which is how much productivity grows over time. And I want to look at the whole economy as itself, the whole U.S. economy, see what's happened to labor productivity growth, how more productive workers are getting, how much more they can produce for a given hour of work. And I want to compare that with the higher wages they get in real terms, that is adjusting for inflation. So effectively, we're looking at how fast the growth of productivity is, how much more workers can produce in a given hour, and that increases over time, that's growth, and same with the real wage. So are they related? And so let's look at a chart that tells you one way or the other. Here's the chart. So in this picture, we have decades on the horizontal axis, 50s, 60s, up into the first decade of this century, the 2000s. And we're on the vertical axis, we have percent per year, that's growth rate, year by year during the different decades. And the blue line is the growth of labor productivity, so that's how much more in percentage terms workers are able to produce with an hour of work. That's close to a measure of marginal product, not exactly the same, but over time the increase in this labor productivity will be close to marginal product. And then we're also plotting the real wage, which is a measure of how much the workers are being compensated for their work, adjusting for inflation, but dividing by the price, as we showed in the algebra. And as you can see, there's a pretty close relationship between the two. The years or decades in which productivity growth is high, say the highest here is the 1950s, as the blue line over there on the left, and in that case, real wage growth is very high as well. Productivity growth lower in the 60s, real wage growth lower. Productivity growth lower in the 70s, real wage growth lower. Productivity growth lower in the 80s, real growth a lot slower. So maybe some other things are going on there. And then we see productivity starting to increase in the 90s and in the 2000s, and you see real wage growth picking up again. So the correlation's pretty high here. It's not perfect, and that means the model's not explaining everything, or maybe the data aren't quite right. But the overall behavior here, the major factor explaining higher incomes, higher real wages of these changes in productivity. And over on the end, it looks like something else must be going on. That makes us wonder to what extent we need to consider other factors than the labor supply and demand model as derived here. And that's what we're going to be considering in the next lesson. To what extent the labor supply and demand model can explain that difference towards the end, gets the general pattern, can explain that thing, what's going on at the end, or can it explain the different real wages for different workers in the market, different types of workers, skilled versus unskilled, etc. We'll consider that next. Thank you.